I'm Erinn Haines, editor-at-large for the 19th, and we are at Howard University in Washington, D.C., continuing our conversation with the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, and actress DeWanda Wise. We're discussing reproductive rights and the upcoming midterm election. So, Madam Vice President, we started our show really talking about the shock that many people felt when Roe was overturned. And certainly many people that I've talked to during this election felt like that moment was really a wake-up call, that many of the rights that we take for granted are under attack. What can you say about what else is at stake, and really what can they do to respond?
Well, as it relates specifically to the Dobbs decision, Justice Clarence Thomas said the quiet part out loud. In his concurring opinion, so as part of the opinion, he said, well, his interpretation of the Constitution suggests that what also is at risk is your right to contraception. Your right to marry the person you love. And understand again, when we are talking about these kinds of attacks on right to privacy, right? It comes from a belief that there are certain things that an individual should be able to decide for themselves. I think of these issues as the issues that relate to heart and home. That your government should not be making those decisions for you. And so this all is potentially under attack. And again, going back to the intersection in terms of which states are attacking which rights, and to see that overlap between voting rights. I mean, you look at a state like Georgia, and I know how I feel about that election, and I hope everyone feels strongly about it too. Where, laws are being passed in our country that would literally make it against the law to give somebody food and water while they're standing in line to exercise their civic responsibility to vote. Laws that are being passed that are intentionally making it more difficult for people to vote. And my theory of the case is this. In 2020, people turned out in record numbers, as some of us have discussed, in the middle of a pandemic. Turned out in record numbers to vote. Young voters, historic number, turned out to vote. And basically said what they wanted from their country and their future. I think that scared some people. So they started passing these laws, making it more difficult for you to vote. Suggesting we would eliminate, in some cases, drop boxes, early voting, vote by mail. And so these are the kinds of rights that are being attacked. You look at what's happening in terms of the attacks that are grounded in hate against members of the LGBTQ community. You look at what's happening in terms of these so-called leaders pounding their chest as though the measure of strength is based on who you beat down, when the true measure of strength is based on who you lift up.
Well, I mean, just to stay with you on that point, and we are seeing young people really in the wake of all of these voter suppression laws that we're seeing passed around the country, young people across America voting in record numbers already headed into the home stretch of these midterm elections. But I know you've also spoken about coalition building as a key part of the solution. Why is it that is such a critical piece of how you are thinking about all of this?
I just strongly believe nobody should be made to fight alone, especially when they are fighting for their rights. And the coalition is about recognizing that the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. And, that old saying, there is power in unity. It's about the collective, right? And the power of the collective to exercise their rights. And I think there is nothing stronger, because truly when you think about the rights that are being attacked, the folks who are most at risk do have so much in common in terms of a number of things that are about the vulnerability to the attacks, but I'd say about something that is also incredibly strong, which is that the fight for each of these things is about the fight for our country to achieve its ideals. You know, I think it's important, you know, when we remember the fight for civil rights, the fight for human rights, the fight for equal rights, this is about challenging our nation to achieve its ideals. And I think there could be no greater act of patriotism as an expression of the love for our country than to fight for our country to achieve its ideals, ideals that were based on the principle of equality and freedom, and liberty and justice.
And DeWanda, I see you nodding your head too. I mean, what do you see can be done as an ordinary citizen? What are you doing?
I feel like, you know, my favorite reminder to everyone is that socio-historically in the United States, all movements have been youth movements. That's right. Like we've only ever seen photos of Harriet Tubman when she was kind of done. Yeah. But she was 27.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was 27 and she did it without the internet.
Well, that too. There was no internet.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So really, you know, the first step is staying inspirited, you know, and the timing of this was really intentional in my opinion, because it was, you know, over the summer, by the time we reached this point where I need you all to get out and vote, they knew that folks were gonna be tired. They knew, you know, that inflation was inflation and it was gonna be inflationing. They knew that there were gonna be all these other issues, because there have been, obviously, for the past 3 years that, you know, would take precedent, and they're banking on the fact that we would forget and get tired. But as much as they speak about, you know, what's in our DNA and there's trauma in our DNA, there's also a lot of fight and resiliency and stamina in our DNA.
Indeed. Okay, well, that's a good note to take a break on, but when we come back, reproductive rights are not just a women's issue. So where do men fit into this? Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Erinn Haines, here with Vice President Kamala Harris and actress DeWanda Wise. So we've already talked about women's health and the work to protect women's reproductive rights, but I do think that some men that are watching this conversation maybe don't grasp how this conversation impacts them. So I want to give both of you an opportunity to talk about that now. DeWanda, I'll come to you first and ask you, why should the fight for women's health and reproductive rights matter to men?
Oh, let's talk about it. So I've taken anatomy and biology, and as far as I know, how children are conceived, you know, it's usually a family choice.
Turns out.
You know, turns out. And as Madam VP was saying before, so many of the women who are seeking this care already have children. You know, it's not the statistics or the cliche or the stereotypes that we're being fed, right? It's families. This is a family decision. And in terms of the intersectionality of it, it impacts so many other sections of society that we're all a part of, right? When you don't have adequate reproductive care for women, businesses suffer. Statistically, businesses, you know. I'm talking the education system, we're talking our foster care system. There's so many other industries that are impacted that men are integral, a part of, running as they do. So, you know, it is our issue. And thankfully, you know, like I said in the conversations that I've been having in the last 4 months, there are organizations, there's Men for Choice, that's really kind of like stomping the yard and getting the messaging out and creating a space for men to convene and really educate themselves and become true allies, like active allies. in the fight. So that's really inspiriting.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, we know that men are already weighing in on this issue, right? But we also know that all issues are women's issues, and women's issues can be everyone's issue.
We can all be feminists.
If we ask them about this. So, Madam Vice President, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Well, I agree. I think that also, if you have a sister or a niece or an auntie or a mother, or you get my point, the people in your life are potentially directly impacted by it. So that is another point. And I think one of the most profound points is this. When people start coming at someone and to take away their rights, we're all vulnerable. It'll just be a minute before they come for some of your rights. So let's not let this train leave the station. Or let's slow it down right now before it goes to the next place. And that's about just seeing what's at play here. And again, back to the point about what Clarence Thomas said. So if you are, if you are a man and you have exercised your right to contraception, that right might very well be at risk. If you are in a same-sex relationship, that is very much at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not to mention, as we talked about, the allyship and why we should all protect the rights of each other, understanding that ultimately it is about our nation. Because I'll also say this, Erinn. As Vice President, I have now met directly or by phone with 100 world leaders.
Yeah. Wow.
So presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, kings. And one of the things about the United States is that we have traditionally had the ability to walk in those rooms and have those conversations, chin up, shoulders back, talking about what it means to represent the strongest democracy in the world, imperfect though we may be. But it gives us the authority then to walk in those rooms and talk about human rights, rule of law. But the thing about being a model then, everyone here knows, when we are role models, people will watch what you do to see if it matches what you say. So my great fear is, in addition to all that we have talked about that is at play, there will be dictators and autocrats around the world who will say to their people who are fighting for these rights, well, you want to hold the United States out as an example? Look what they're doing. You be quiet. And in that way, there is a real potential in this moment for the issues that we have discussed to not only affect the American people, but people around the world. Yeah. And that is what we have to understand, is the magnitude and the span of all of this in terms of the various rights and who is potentially vulnerable.
Yeah. Not just implications for this country, but globally, there are implications. Yeah. So we need to take another break, but when we come back, we're going to have some final thoughts about what's at stake in these midterm elections. Stay with us. Welcome back. And final thoughts now with actress DeWanda Wise and Vice President Kamala Harris. So tomorrow is Election Day, and we always hear that voting is important, that this is an important election, but this election really does seem more consequential, especially after the conversation that three of us have just had. So I want to give each of you a final word really about the importance of tomorrow's election and the importance of voting. And DeWanda, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I understand being and feeling disillusioned, and the fear that your vote doesn't matter. But clearly, the night before is an opportune moment to just remind us that every freedom that we have, every freedom that we take for granted, this one that I absolutely did myself, just a couple of months ago, completely wasn't thinking about it, that we fought for, that we voted for in this country. And that's what's at stake tomorrow, to just go out and exercise that right that many of our ancestors fought for. I know you hear that a lot, but really just taking a moment tonight to internalize what that means, that there are those who, in our families, outside of our families, gave their lives for this right, to exercise this right that we have tomorrow. And so I know you're tired, but, get a good night's rest, get up, and head to those polls.
Yeah, absolutely. And take somebody with you. Madam Vice President, the last word goes to you.
Well, I mean, DeWanda said it, but here's the thing. It's a power that we each have to vote. It's a power that in the many ways we use our voice, that is one of them. And I strongly believe you should never let anybody take your power from you. Don't let anybody take your power from you. And I guess my final point would be this. We've been talking a lot about democracy, and democracy is on the ballot. And here's the thing. I think that the nature of democracies is that it's kind of, there's a duality to it. On the one hand, when democracies are intact, they're extremely strong in what they do to fight for and defend people's rights, right? Your rights, your right to be, your right to equality, your right to freedom. When they are intact, they're strong in terms of what they give to protect and defend individual rights. On the other hand, it's very fragile, democracy. It will only be as strong as our willingness to fight for it. And so fight we must. Fight we will. Every right, every freedom we have attained so far was because we were willing to fight for it, born out of love of our country and our knowledge that when we fight, we win. That's it.
So with that, I want to thank Howard University for hosting this critical conversation. And also thank you to DeWanda Wise and to Vice President Kamala Harris for being here with us. Everybody make sure that your voice is heard. Get out there and vote. Have a good night.